Hi everyone and welcome back to my full diamond paintings. I am Netta and this is part 7 of our chill diamond painting series featuring The Italian by Ann Radcliffe. It's another cozy work in progress session. This canvas is slowly coming together, one sparkle at a time. And for those who are new, WIP stands for work in progress. So while we are listening to the audiobook by Ann Radcliffe, I will be working on my diamond painting. So whether you are crafting with me, listening in, or just relaxing, you are in the right place. We will dive into chapters, let's see, chapters 9 and 10. Let me see, 10 and 11, 9 and 10, yes. We will dive into chapters 9 and 10 today. I am on one third of a diamond painting done, almost. And let me know in the comments, what are you working on right now? Are you cross-stitching, crocheting, coloring, doing puzzles, or just relaxing with a snack? I would love to see what everyone is up to. Without further ado, let's hear chapters 9 and 10.
Chapter 9 of The Italian. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Elizabeth Morant. The Italian by Ann Radcliffe. Chapter 9. He, like the tenant of some night-haunted ruin, bore an aspect of horror, worn to habitude. Mysterious mother. The adventurous Vivaldi and his servant Paolo, after passing the night of Elena's departure from Villa Altieri in one of the subterraneous chambers of the fort of Paluzzi, and yielding, at length, to exhausted nature, awoke in terror and utter darkness, for the flambeau had expired. When a recollection of the occurrences of the preceding evening returned, they renewed their efforts for liberty with ardour. The grated window was again examined, and being found to overlook only a confined court of the fortress, no hope appeared of escaping. The words of the monk returned with Vivaldi's first recollections, to torture him with apprehension, that Elena was no more; and Paolo, unable either to console or to appease his master, sat down dejectedly beside him. Paolo had no longer a hope to suggest or a joke to throw away, and he could not forbear seriously remarking that to die of hunger was one of the most horrible means of death, or lamenting the rashness which had made them liable to so sad a probability. He was in the midst of a very pathetic oration, of which, however, his master did not hear a single word, so wholly was his attention engaged by his own melancholy thoughts, when on a sudden he became silent, and then, starting to his feet, exclaimed, "Signor, what is yonder? Do you see nothing?" Vivaldi looked round. "It is certainly a ray of light," continued Paolo, "and I will soon know where it comes from." As he said this he sprung forward, and his surprise almost equalled his joy when he discovered that the light issued through the door of the vault, which stood a little open. He could scarcely believe his senses, since the door had been strongly fastened on the preceding night, and he had not heard its ponderous bolts undrawn. He threw it widely open, but recollecting himself, stopped to look into the adjoining vault before he ventured forth, when Vivaldi darted past him, and bidding him follow instantly, ascended to the day. The courts of the fortress were silent and vacant, and Vivaldi reached the archway without having observed a single person, breathless with speed, and scarcely daring to believe that he had regained his liberty. Beneath the arch he stopped to recover breath, and to consider whether he should take the road to Naples or to the Villa Altieri, for it was yet early morning, at an hour when it appeared improbable that Elena's family would be risen. The apprehension of her death had vanished as Vivaldi's spirits revived, which the pause of hesitation sufficiently announced. But even this was the pause only of an instant. A strong anxiety concerning her determined him to proceed to the Villa Altieri, notwithstanding the unsuitableness of the hour, since he could, at least, reconnoitre her residence, and await till some sign of the family having risen should appear. "Pray, Signor," said Paolo, while his master was deliberating, "do not let us stop here, lest the enemy should appear again. And do, Signor, take the road which is nearest to some house where we may get breakfast, for the fear of starving has taken such hold upon me that it has nearly anticipated the reality of it already." Vivaldi immediately departed for the villa. Paolo, as he danced joyfully along, expressed all the astonishment that filled his mind, as to the cause of their late imprisonment and escape; but Vivaldi, who had now leisure to consider the subject, could not assist him in explaining it. The only certainty that appeared was, that he had not been confined by robbers, and what interest any person could have in imprisoning him for the night, and suffering him to escape in the morning, did not appear. On entering the garden at Altieri, he was surprised to observe that several of the lower lattices were open at this early hour, but surprise changed to terror, when on reaching the portico he heard a moaning of distress from the hall, and when, after loudly calling, he was answered by the piteous cries of Beatrice. The hall door was fastened, and Beatrice being unable to open it, Vivaldi, followed by Paolo, sprang through one of the unclosed lattices, when on reaching the hall he found the housekeeper bound to a pillar, and learned that Elena had been carried off during the night by armed men. For a moment he was almost stupefied by the shock of this intelligence, and then asked Beatrice 1,000 questions concerning the affair, without allowing her time to answer one of them. When, however, he had patience to listen, he learned that the ruffians were 4 in number, that they were masked, that 2 of them had carried Elena through the garden, while the others, after binding Beatrice to a pillar, threatening her with death if she made any noise, and watching over her till the comrades had secured their prize, left her a prisoner. This was all the information she could give respecting Elena. Vivaldi, when he could think coolly, believed he had discovered the instigators in the design of the whole affair, and the cause also of his late confinement. It appeared that Elena had been carried off by order of his family, to prevent the intended marriage, and that he had been decoyed into the fort of Paluzzi, and kept a prisoner there, to prevent him from intercepting the scheme, which his presence at the Villa Altieri would effectually have done. He had himself spoken of his former adventure at Paluzzi, and it now appeared that his family had taken advantage of the curiosity he had expressed to lead him into the vaults. The event of this design was the more certain since, as the fort lay in the direct road to the Villa Altieri, Vivaldi could not go thither without being observed by the creatures of the Marchesa, who, by an artful manoeuvre, might make him their prisoner, without employing violence. As he considered these circumstances, it appeared certain also that Father Schedoni was in truth the monk who had so long haunted his steps, that he was the secret adviser of his mother, and one of the authors of the predicted misfortunes, which, it seemed, he possessed a too certain means of fulfilling. Yet Vivaldi, while he admitted the probability of all this, reflected with new astonishment on the conduct of Schedoni during his interview with him in the Marchesa's cabinet, the air of dignified innocence with which he had repressed accusation, the apparent simplicity with which he had pointed out circumstances respecting the stranger that seemed to make against himself, and Vivaldi's opinion of the confessor's duplicity began to waver. "Yet what other person," said he, "could be so intimately acquainted with my concerns, or have an interest sufficiently strong for thus indefatigably thwarting me, except this confessor, who is, no doubt, well rewarded for his perseverance? The monk can be no other than Schedoni, yet it is strange that he should have forborne to disguise his person, and should appear in his mysterious office in the very habit he usually wears." Whatever might be the truth as to Schedoni, it was evident that Elena had been carried away by order of Vivaldi's family, and he immediately returned towards Naples with an intention of demanding her at their hands, not with any hope of their compliance, but believing that they might accidentally afford him some lights on the subject. If, however, he should fail to obtain any hint that might assist him in tracing the route she had been carried, he determined to visit Schedoni, accuse him of perfidy, urge him to a full explanation of his conduct, and, if possible, obtain from him a knowledge of Elena's place of confinement. When at length he obtained an interview with the Marchese, and throwing himself at his feet, supplicated that Elena might be restored to her home, the unaffected surprise of his father overwhelmed him with astonishment and despair. The look and manner of the Marchese could not be doubted. Vivaldi was convinced that he was absolutely ignorant of any step which had been taken against Elena. "However ungraciously you have conducted yourself," said the Marchese, "my honour has never yet been sullied by duplicity. However I may have wished to break the unworthy connection you have formed, I should disdain to employ artifice as the means. If you really design to marry this person, I shall make no other effort to prevent such a measure, than by telling you the consequence you are to expect. From thenceforth I will disown you from my son." The Marchese quitted the apartment when he had said this, and Vivaldi made no attempt to detain him. His words expressed little more than they had formerly done, yet Vivaldi was shocked by the absolute menace now delivered. The stronger passion of his heart, however, soon overcame their effect, and this moment, when he began to fear that he had irrevocably lost the object of his dearest affections, was not the time in which he could long feel remoter evils, or calculate the force of misfortunes which never might arrive. The nearer interest pressed solely upon his mind, and he was conscious only to the loss of Elena. The interview which followed with his mother was of a different character from that which had occurred with the Marchese. The keen dart of suspicion, however sharpened as it was by love and by despair, pierced beyond the veil of her duplicity, and Vivaldi as quickly detected her hypocrisy as he had yielded his conviction to the sincerity of the Marchese. But his power rested here. He possessed no means of awakening her pity or actuating her justice, and could not obtain even a hint that might guide him in his search of Elena. Schedoni, however, yet remained to be tried. Vivaldi had no longer a doubt as to his having caballed with the Marchesa, and that he had been an agent in removing Elena. Whether he was the person who haunted the ruins of Paluzzi still remained to be proved, for though several circumstances seemed to declare that he was, others, not less plausible, asserted the contrary. On leaving the Marchesa's apartment, Vivaldi repaired to the convent of the Spirito Santo, and inquired for Father Schedoni. The lay brother who opened the gate informed him that the father was in his cell, and Vivaldi stepped impatiently into the court, requesting to be shewn thither. "I dare not leave the gate, signor," said the brother, "but if you cross the court, and ascend that staircase which you see yonder beyond the doorway on your right, it will lead you to a gallery, and the third door you will come to is Father Schedoni's." Vivaldi passed on without seeing another human being, and not a sound disturbed the silence of this sanctuary. As he ascended the stairs, a feeble note of lamentation proceeded from the gallery, and he concluded it was uttered by some penitent at confession. He stopped, as he had been directed, at the third door, when, as he gently knocked, the sound ceased, and the same profound silence returned. Vivaldi repeated his summons, but receiving no answer, he ventured to open the door. In the dusky cell within no person appeared, but he still looked round, expecting to discover some one in the dubious gloom. The chamber contained little more than a mattress, a chair, a table, and a crucifix. Some books of devotion were upon the table, one or two which were written in unknown characters. Several instruments of torture lay beside them. Vivaldi shuddered as he hastily examined these, though he did not comprehend the manner of their application, and he left the chamber without noticing any other object, and returned to the court. The porter said that since Father Schedoni was not in his cell, he was probably either in the church or in the gardens, for that he had not passed the gates during the morning. "Did he pass yester evening?" said Vivaldi eagerly. "Yes, he returned to vespers," replied the brother with surprise. "Are you certain as to that, my friend?" rejoined Vivaldi. "Are you certain that he slept in the convent last night?" "Who is it that asks the question?" said the lay brother with displeasure. "And what right has he to make it? You are ignorant of the rules of our house, signor, or you would perceive such questions to be unnecessary. Any member of our community is liable to be severely punished if he sleep a night without these walls, and Father Schedoni would be the last among us so to trespass. He is one of the most pious of the brotherhood. Few indeed have courage to imitate his severe example. His voluntary sufferings are sufficient for a saint. He passed the night abroad? Go, signor, yonder is the church. You will find him there, perhaps." Vivaldi did not linger to reply. "The hypocrite!" said he to himself, as he crossed to the church, which formed one side of the quadrangle. "But I will unmask him." The church which he entered was vacant and silent like the court. "Whither can the inhabitants of this place have withdrawn themselves?" said he. Wherever I go, I hear only the echoes of my own footsteps. It seems as if death reigned here over all. But perhaps it is one of the hours of general meditation, and the monks have only retired to their cells." As he paced the long aisles, he suddenly stopped to catch the startling sound that murmured through the lofty roof, but it seemed to be only the closing of a distant door. Yet he often looked forward into the sacred gloom which the painted windows threw over the remote perspective, in the expectation of perceiving a monk. He was not long disappointed. A person appeared, standing silently in an obscure part of the cloister, clothed in the habit of this society, and he advanced towards him. The monk did not avoid Vivaldi, or even turn to observe who was approaching, but remained in the same attitude, fixed like a statue. This tall and gaunt figure had, at a distance, reminded him of Schedoni, and Vivaldi, as he now looked under the cowl, discovered the ghastly countenance of the confessor. "Have I found you at last?" said Vivaldi. "I would speak with you, father, in private. This is not a proper place for such discourse as we must hold." Schedoni made no reply, and Vivaldi, once again looking at him, observed that his features were fixed, and his eyes bent towards the ground. The words of Vivaldi seemed not to have reached his understanding, nor even to have made any impression on his senses. He repeated them in a louder tone, but still not a single line of Schedoni's countenance acknowledged their influence. "What means this mummery?" said he, his patience exhausted, and his indignation aroused. "This wretched subterfuge shall not protect you. You are detected, your stratagems are known. Restore Elena di Rosalba to her home, or confess where you have concealed her." Schedoni was still silent and unmoved. A respect for his age and profession withheld Vivaldi from seizing and compelling him to answer, but the agony of impatience and indignation which he suffered formed a striking contrast to the death-like apathy of the monk. "I now also know you," continued Vivaldi, "for my tormentor at Paluzzi, the prophet of evils, which you too well practised the means of fulfilling, the predictor of the death of Signora Bianchi." Schedoni frowned. "The forewarner of Elena's departure, the phantom who decoyed me into the dungeons of Paluzzi, the prophet and the artificer of all my misfortunes." The monk raised his eyes from the ground, and fixed them with terrible expression upon Vivaldi, but was still silent. "Yes, father," added Vivaldi, "I know and will proclaim you to the world. I will strip you of the holy hypocrisy in which you shroud yourself, announce to all your society the despicable artifices you have employed, and the misery you have occasioned. Your character shall be announced aloud." While Vivaldi spoke, the monk had withdrawn his eyes, and fixed them again on the ground. His countenance had resumed its usual expression. "Wretch, restore me to Elena di Rosalba!" cried Vivaldi, with the sudden anguish of renewed despair. "Tell me at least where she may be found, or you shall be compelled to do so. Whither have you conveyed her?" As he pronounced this in loud and passionate accents, several ecclesiastics entered the cloisters, and were passing on to the body of the church, when his voice arrested their attention. They paused, and perceiving the singular attitude of Schedoni, and the frantic gesticulations of Vivaldi, hastily advanced towards them. "Forbear," said one of the strangers, as he seized the cloak of Vivaldi. "Do you not observe?" "I observe a hypocrite," replied Vivaldi, stepping back and disengaging himself. "I observe a destroyer of the peace. It was his duty to protect. I—" "Forbear this desperate conduct," said the priest, "lest it provoke the just vengeance of Heaven. Do you not observe the holy office in which he is engaged?" pointing to the monk. "Leave the church while you are permitted to do so in safety. You suspect not the punishment you may provoke." "I will not quit the spot till you answer my enquiries," said Vivaldi to Schedoni, without deigning even to look upon the priest. "Where, I repeat, is Elena di Rosalba?" The confessor was still silent and unmoved. "This is beyond all patience and all belief," continued Vivaldi. "Speak, answer me, or dread what I may unfold. Yet silent? Do you know the Convent del Pianto? Do you know the confessional of the Black Penitents?" Vivaldi thought he perceived the countenance of the monk suffer some change. "Do you remember that terrible night," he added, "when on the steps of that confessional a tale was told?" Schedoni raised his eyes, and fixing them once more on Vivaldi, with a look that seemed intended to strike him to the dust. "Avaunt!" cried he in a tremendous voice. "Avaunt, sacrilegious boy! Tremble for the consequence of thy desperate impiety!" As he concluded, he started from his position, and gliding with the silent swiftness of a shadow along the cloister, vanished in an instant. Vivaldi, when attempting to pursue him, was seized by the surrounding monks. Insensible to his sufferings, and exasperated by his assertions, they threatened that if he did not immediately leave the convent, he should be confined, and undergo the severe punishments to which he had become liable, for having disturbed and even insulted one of their holy order while performing an act of penance. "He has need of such acts," said Vivaldi, "but when can they restore the happiness his treachery has destroyed? Your order is disgraced by such a member, reverend fathers. Your—" "Peace!" cried a monk. "He is the pride of our house. He is severe in his devotion, and in self-punishment terrible beyond the reach of— But I am throwing away my commendations. I am talking to one who is not permitted to value or to understand the sacred mysteries of our exercises." "Away with him to the Padre Abate!" cried an enraged priest. "Away with him to the dungeon!" "Away, away!" repeated his companions, and they endeavoured to force Vivaldi through the cloisters. But with the sudden strength which pride and indignation lent him, he burst from their united hold, and quitting the church by another door, escaped into the street. Vivaldi returned home in a state of mind that would have engaged the pity of any heart, which prejudice or self-interest had not hardened. He avoided his father, but sought the Marchesa, who, triumphant in the success of her plan, was still insensible to the sufferings of her son. When the Marchesa had been informed of his approaching marriage, she had, as usual, consulted with her confessor on the means of preventing it, who had advised the scheme she adopted, a scheme which was the more easily carried into effect since the Marchesa had early in life been acquainted with the Abbess of San Stefano, and knew, therefore, enough of her character and disposition to confide, without hesitation, the management of this important affair to her discretion. The answer of the abbess to her proposal was not merely acquiescent, but zealous, and it appeared that she too faithfully justified the confidence reposed in her. After this plan had been so successfully prosecuted, it was not to be hoped that the Marchesa would be prevailed upon to relinquish it by the tears, the anguish, or all the varied sufferings of her son. Vivaldi now reproved the easiness of his own confidence in having hoped it, and quitted her cabinet with a despondency that almost reached despair. The faithful Paolo obeyed the hasty summons of his master, but he had not succeeded in obtaining intelligence of Elena, and Vivaldi, having dismissed him again on the same enquiry, retired to his apartment, where the excess of grief and a feeble hope of devising some successful mode of remedy alternately agitated and detained him. In the evening, restless and anxious for change, though scarcely knowing whither to bend his course, he left the palace and strolled down to the sea-beach. A few fishermen and lazzaroni only were loitering along the strand, waiting for boats from St. Lucia. Vivaldi, with folded arms, and his hat drawn over his face to shade his sorrow from observation, paced the edge of the waves, listening to their murmur, as they broke gently at his feet, and gazing upon their undulating beauty, while all consciousness was lost in melancholy reverie concerning Elena. Her late residence appeared at a distance, rising over the shore. He remembered how often from thence they had together viewed this lovely scene. Its features had now lost their charm; they were colourless and uninteresting, or impressed only mournful ideas. The sea fluctuating beneath the setting sun, the long mole and its lighthouse tipped with the last rays, fishermen reposing in the shade, little boats skimming over the smooth waters, which their oars scarcely dimpled, these were images that brought to his recollection the affecting evening when he had last seen this picture from the Villa Altieri, when, seated in the orangery with Elena and Bianchi, on the night preceding the death of the latter, Elena herself had so solemnly been given to his care, and had so affectingly consented to the dying request of her relative. The recollection of that scene came to Vivaldi with all the force of contrast, and renewed all the anguish of despair. He paced the beach with quicker steps, and long groans burst from his heart. He accused himself of indifference and inactivity, for having been thus long unable to discover a single circumstance which might direct his search; and though he knew not whither to go, he determined to leave Naples immediately, and return no more to his father's mansion till he should have rescued Elena. Of some fishermen who were conversing together upon the beach, he inquired whether they could accommodate him with a boat, in which he meant to coast the bay, for it appeared probable that Elena had been conveyed from Altieri by water to some town or convent on the shore. the privacy and facility of such a mode of conveyance being suitable to the designs of her enemies. "I have but one boat, señor," said a fisherman, "and that is busy enough in going to and fro from here in Santa Lucia. But my comrade here perhaps can serve you. What, Carlo, can you help the señor to your little skiff? The other, I know, has enough to do in the trade." His comrade, however, was too much engaged with a party of 3 or 4 men, who were listening in deep attention round him, to reply. Vivaldi, advancing to urge the question, was struck by the eagerness with which he delivered his narrative, as well as the uncouthness of his gesticulation, and he paused a moment in attention. One of the auditors seemed to doubt of something that had been asserted. "I tell you," replied the narrator, "I used to carry fish there 2 and 3 times a week, and very good sort of people they were. They have laid out many a ducat with me in their time. But as I was saying, when I got there, and knocked upon the door, I heard, all of a sudden, a huge groaning, and presently I heard the voice of the old housekeeper herself, roaring out for help. But I could give her none, for the door was fastened. And while I ran away for assistance to old Bartoli, you know old Bartoli, he lives by the roadside as you go to Naples, well, while I ran to him, comes a signor and jumps through the window and sets her at liberty at once. So then I heard the whole story." "What story?" said Vivaldi, "and of whom do you speak?" "All in good time, maestro, you shall hear," said the fisherman, who, looking at him for a moment, added, "Why, señor, it should be you I saw there. You should be the very señor that let Beatrice loose." Vivaldi, who had scarcely doubted before that it was Altieri of which the man had spoken, now asked 1,000 questions respecting the route the ruffians had taken Elena, but obtained no relief to his anxiety. "I should not wonder," said a Lazzaro, who had been listening to the relation, "I should not wonder if the carriage that passed Braccelli early on the same morning, with the blinds drawn up, though it was so hot that people could scarcely breathe in the open air, should prove to be it which carried off the lady." This hint was sufficient to reanimate Vivaldi, who collected all the information that Lazzaro could give, which was, however, little more than that a carriage, such as he described, had been seen by him, driving furiously through Braccelli, early on the morning mentioned as that of Signora di Rosalba's departure. Vivaldi had now no doubt as to its being the one which conveyed her away, and he determined to set out immediately for that place, where he hoped to obtain from the postmaster further intelligence concerning the road she had pursued. With this intention he returned once more to his father's mansion, not to acquaint him with his purpose, or to bid him farewell, but to await the return of his servant Paolo, who he meant should accompany him in the search. Vivaldi's spirits were now animated with hope, slender as were the circumstances that supported it, and believing his design to be wholly unsuspected by those who would be disposed to interrupt it, he did not guard either against the measures which might impede his departure from Naples, or those which might overtake him on his journey. End of chapter 9. Recording by Elizabeth Morant, lizmorant@gmail.com.
Chapter 10 of The Italian.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Elizabeth Morant. The Italian by Ann Radcliffe.
Chapter 10.
What, wouldst thou have a serpent sting thee twice? Shakespeare. The Marchesa, alarmed at some hints dropped by Vivaldi in the late interview between them, and by some circumstances of his latter conduct, summoned her constant adviser, Schedoni. Still suffering with the insult he had received in the Church of the Spirito Santo, he obeyed with sullen reluctance, yet not without a malicious hope of discovering some opportunity for retaliation. That insult, which had pointed forth his hypocrisy, and ridiculed the solemn abstraction he assumed, had sunk deep in his heart, and, fermenting the direst passions of his nature, he meditated a terrible revenge. It had subjected him to mortifications of various kinds. Ambition, it has already appeared, was one of his strongest motives of action, and he had long since assumed a character of severe sanctity, chiefly for the purposes of lifting him to promotion. He was not beloved in the society of which he was a member, and many of the brotherhood, who had labored to disappoint his views, and to detect his errors, who hated him for his pride, and envied him for his reputed sanctity, now gloried in the mortification he had received, and endeavoured to turn the circumstance to their own advantage. They had not scrupled already to display by insinuation and pointed sneers their triumph, and to menace his reputation, and Schedoni, though he deserved contempt, was not of a temper to endure it. But above all, some hints respecting his past life, which had fallen from Vivaldi, and which occasioned him so abruptly to leave the church, alarmed him. So much terror, indeed, had they excited, that it is not improbable that he would have sealed his secret in death, devoting Vivaldi to the grave, had he not been restrained by the dreaded vengeance of the Vivaldi family. Since that hour he had known no peace, and had never slept. He had taken scarcely any food, and was almost continually on his knees upon the steps of the high altar. The devotees who beheld him paused and admired. Such of the brothers as disliked him sneered and passed on. Schedoni appeared alike insensible to each, lost to this world, and preparing for a higher. The torments of his mind and the severe penance he had observed had produced a surprising change in his appearance, so that he resembled a spectre rather than a human being. His visage was wan and wasted, his eyes were sunk and become nearly motionless, and his whole air and attitudes exhibited the wild energy of something not of this earth. When he was summoned by the Marchesa, his conscience whispered this to be the consequence of circumstances, which Vivaldi had revealed, and at first he had determined not to attend her. But, considering that if it was so, his refusal would confirm suspicion, he resolved to trust once more to the subtlety of his address for deliverance. With these apprehensions, tempered by this hope, he entered the Marchesa's closet. She almost started on observing him, and could not immediately withdraw her eyes from his altered visage, which, while Schedoni was unable wholly to conceal the perturbation which such earnest observation occasioned. "Peace rest with you, daughter," said he, and he seated himself without lifting his eyes from the floor. "I wished to speak with you, father, upon affairs of moment," said the Marchesa gravely, "which are probably not unknown to you." She paused, and Schedoni bowed his head, awaiting in anxious expectation what was to follow. "You are silent, father," resumed the Marchesa. "What am I to understand by this?" "That you have been misinformed," replied Schedoni, whose apt conscience betrayed his discretion. "Pardon me," said the Marchesa. "I am too well informed, and should not have requested your visit if any doubt had remained upon my mind." "Signora, be cautious of what you credit," said the confessor imprudently. "You know not the consequence of a hasty credulity." "Would that mine were a rash credulity," replied the Marchesa, "but we are betrayed." "We," repeated the monk, beginning to revive. "What has happened?" The Marchesa informed him of Vivaldi's absence, and inferred from its length, for it was now several days since his departure, that he had certainly discovered the place of Elena's confinement, as well as the authors of it. Schedoni differed from her, but hinted that the obedience of youth was hopeless, unless severer measures were adopted. "Severer!" exclaimed the Marchesa. "Good father, is it not severe enough to confine her for life?" "I mean severer with respect to your son, lady," replied Schedoni. "When a young man has so far overcome all reverence for a holy ordinance as publicly to insult its professors, and yet more when that professor is in the very performance of his duties, it is time he should be controlled with a strong hand. I am not in the practice of advising such measures, but the conduct of Signor Vivaldi is such as calls aloud for them. Public decency demands it. For myself, indeed, I should have endured patiently the indignity which has been offered me, receiving it as a salutatory mortification, as one of those inflictions that purify the soul from the pride which even the holiest men may unconsciously cherish. but I am no longer permitted to consider myself. The public good requires that an example should be made of the horrible impiety of which your son, it grieves me, daughter, to disclose it, your son, unworthy of such a mother, has been guilty." It is evident that in the style, at least, of this accusation, Schedoni suffered the force of his resentment to prevail over the usual subtlety of his address, the deep and smooth insinuation of his policy. "To what do you allude, righteous father?" inquired the astonished Marchesa. "What indignity, what impiety has my son to answer for? I entreat you will speak explicitly, that I may prove I can lose the mother in the strict severity of the judge." "That is spoken with the grandeur of sentiment which has always distinguished you, my daughter. Strong minds perceive that justice is the highest of the moral attributes. Mercy is only the favourite of weak ones." Schedoni had a view in this commendation beyond that of confirming the Marchesa's present resolution against Vivaldi. He wished to prepare her for measures which might hereafter be necessary to accomplish the revenge he meditated, and he knew that by flattering her vanity he was most likely to succeed. He praised her, therefore, for qualities he wished her to possess, encouraged her to reject general opinions by admiring, as the symptoms of a superior understanding, the convenient morality upon which she had occasionally acted, and calling sternness justice, extolled that for strength of mind, which was only callous insensibility. He then described to her Vivaldi's late conduct in the Church of the Spirito Santo, exaggerated some offensive circumstances of it, invented others, and formed of the whole an instance of monstrous impiety and unprovoked insult. The Marchesa listened to the relation with no less indignation than surprise, and her readiness to adopt the confessor's advice allowed him to depart with renovated spirits and most triumphant hopes. Meanwhile the Marchese remained ignorant of the subject of the conference with Schedoni. His opinions had formerly been sounded, and having been found decidedly against the dark policy it was thought expedient to practice, he was never afterwards consulted respecting Vivaldi. Parental anxiety and affection began to revive as the lengthened absence of his son was observed. Though jealous of his rank, he loved Vivaldi, and, though he had never positively believed that he designed to enter into a sacred engagement with a person whom the Marchese considered to be so much his inferior as Elena, he had suffered doubts, which gave him considerable uneasiness. The present extraordinary absence of Vivaldi renewed his alarm. He apprehended that if she was discovered at this moment, when the fear of losing her for ever and the exasperation which such complicated opposition occasioned had awakened all the passions of his son, this rash young man might be prevailed upon to secure her for his own by the indissoluble vow. On the other hand, he dreaded the effect of Vivaldi's despair, should he fail in the pursuit, and thus, fearing at one moment that for which he wished in the next, the Marchese suffered a tumult of mind inferior only to his son's. The instructions which he delivered to the servants whom he sent in pursuit of Vivaldi were given under such distraction of thought that scarcely any person perfectly understood his commission, and, as the Marchesa had been careful to conceal from him her knowledge of Elena's abode, he gave no direction concerning the route to San Stefano. While the Marchesa at Naples was thus employed, and while Schedoni was forming further plans against Elena, Vivaldi was wandering from village to village and from town to town in pursuit of her, whom all his efforts had hitherto been unsuccessful to recover. From the people at the post-house at Braccelli he had obtained little information that could direct him. They only knew that a carriage, such had been already described to Vivaldi, with the blinds drawn up, changed horses there on the morning, which he remembered to be that of Elena's departure, and had proceeded on the road to Morgagni. When Vivaldi arrived thither, all trace of Elena was lost. The master of the post could not recollect a single circumstance connected with the travellers, and even if he had noticed them, it would have been insufficient for Vivaldi's purpose, unless he had also observed the road they followed, for at this place several roads branched off into opposite quarters of the country. Vivaldi therefore was reduced to choose one of these, as chance or fancy directed, and as it appeared probable that the Marchesa had conveyed Elena to a convent, he determined to make enquiries at every one on his way. He had now passed over some of the wildest tracts of the Apennine, among scenes which seemed abandoned by civilized society to the banditti who haunted their recesses. Yet even here amidst wilds that were nearly inaccessible, convents with each its small dependent hamlet were scattered and shrouded from the world by woods and mountains, enjoyed unsuspectedly many of its luxuries, and displayed unnoticed some of its elegance. Vivaldi, who had visited several of these in search of Elena, had been surprised at the refined courtesy and hospitality with which he was received. It was on the 7th day of his journey and near sunset that he was bewildered in the woods of Ruggieri. He had received a direction for the road he was to take at a village some leagues distant, and had obeyed it confidently till now, when the path was lost in several tracks that branched out among the trees. The day was closing, and Vivaldi's spirits began to fail, but Paolo, light of heart and ever gay, commended the shade and pleasant freshness of the woods, and observed that if his master did lose his way, and was obliged to remain here for the night, it could not be so very unlucky, for they could climb up among the branches of a chestnut, and find a more neat and airy lodging than any inn had yet afforded them. While Paolo was thus endeavouring to make the best of what might happen, and his master was sunk in reverie, they suddenly heard the sound of instruments and voices from a distance. The gloom which the trees threw around prevented their distinguishing objects afar off, and not a single human being was visible, nor any trace of his art, beneath the shadowy scene. They listened to ascertain from what direction the sounds approached, and heard a chorus of voices accompanied by a few instruments performing the evening service. "We are near a convent, signor," said Paolo. "Listen, they are at their devotions." "It is as you say," replied Vivaldi, "and we will make the best of our way towards it." "Well, signor, I must say, if we find as good doings here as we had at the Capuchins, we shall have no reason to regret our beds al fresco among the chestnut branches." "Do you perceive any walls or spires beyond the trees?" said Vivaldi as he led the way. "None, signor," replied Paolo, "yet we draw nearer the sounds. Ah, signor, do you hear that note? How it dies away! And those instruments just touched in symphony! This is not the music of peasants. A convent must be near, though we do not see it." Still as they advanced no walls appeared, and soon after the music ceased, but other sounds led Vivaldi forward to a pleasant part of the woods, where the trees opening he perceived a party of pilgrims seated on the grass. They were laughing and conversing with much gaiety, as each spread before him the supper, which he drew from his scrip, while he, who appeared to be the father director of the pilgrimage, sat with a jovial countenance in the midst of the company, dispensing jokes and merry stories, and receiving in return a tribute from every scrip. Wines of various sorts were ranged before him, of which he drank abundantly, and seemed not to refuse any dainty that was offered. Vivaldi, whose apprehensions were now quieted, stopped to observe the group, as the evening rays, glancing along the skirts of the wood, threw a gleam upon their various countenances, shewing, however, in such a spirit of gaiety that might have characterized the individuals of a party of pleasure rather than those of a pilgrimage. The father director and his flock seemed perfectly to understand each other. The superior willingly resigned the solemn austerity of his office, and permitted the company to make themselves as happy as possible, in consideration of receiving plenty of the most delicate of their viands. Yet somewhat of dignity was mingled with his condescensions that compelled them to receive even his jokes with a degree of deference, and perhaps they laughed at them less for their spirit than because they were favours. Addressing the superior, Vivaldi requested to be directed how he might regain his way. The father examined him for a moment before he replied, but observing the elegance of his dress, and a certain air of distinction, and perceiving also that Paolo was his servant, he promised his services and invited him to take a seat at his right hand and partake of the supper. Vivaldi, understanding that the party was going his road, accepted the invitation, when Paolo, having fastened the horses to a tree, soon became busy with the supper. While Vivaldi conversed with the father, Paolo engrossed all the attention of the pilgrims near him. They declared he was the cleverest and the merriest fellow they had ever seen, and often expressed a wish that he was going as far with them as to the shrine in a convent of Carmelites, which terminated with their pilgrimage. When Vivaldi understood that this shrine was in the church of a convent partly inhabited by nuns, and that it was little more than a league and a half distant, he determined to accompany them, for it was as possible that Elena was confined there as in any other cloister, and of her being imprisoned in some convent he had less doubt the more he considered the character and views of his mother. He set forward, therefore, with the pilgrims, and on foot, having resigned his horse to the weary Father Director. Darkness closed over them long before they reached the village where they designed to pass the night, but they beguiled the way with songs and stories, now and then only stopping at the command of the Father to repeat some prayer or sing a hymn. But as they drew near a village at the base of the mountains on which the shrine stood, they halted to arrange themselves in procession, and the superior, having stopped short in the midst of one of his best jokes, dismounted Vivaldi's horse, placing himself at their head, and beginning a loud strain, they proceeded in full chorus of melancholy music. The peasants, hearing their sonorous voices, came forth to meet and conduct them to their cabins. The village was already crowded with devotees, but these poor peasants, looking up to them with love and reverence, made every possible contrivance to accommodate all who came, notwithstanding which, when Paolo soon after turned into his bed of straw, he had more reasons than one to regret his chestnut mattress. Vivaldi passed an anxious night, waiting impatiently for the dawning of that day, which might possibly restore him to Elena. Considering that a pilgrim's habit would not only conceal him from suspicion, but allow him opportunities for observation, which his own dress would not permit, he employed Paolo to provide him one. The address of the servant, assisted by a single ducat, easily procured it, and at an early hour he set forward on his enquiry.
End chapter 10.
Recording by Liz Morant, lizmorant@gmail.com.
Chapter 11 of The Italian. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Italian by Ann Radcliffe, read by Gary Day. Section 11. Chapter 11. Bring roses, violets, and the cold snowdrop, beautiful in tears, to strew the pathway of our saintly sister. A few devotees only had begun to ascend the mountain, and Vivaldi kept aloof even from these, pursuing a lonely track, for his thoughtful mind desired solitude. The early breeze sighing among the foliage that waved high over the path, and the hollow dashing of distant waters, he listened to with complacency, for these were sounds which soothed yet promoted his melancholy mood, and he sometimes rested to gaze upon the scenery around him, for this too was in harmony with the temper of his mind. Disappointment had subdued the wilder energy of the passions, and produced a solemn and lofty state of feeling. He viewed with pleasing sadness the dark rocks and precipices, the gloomy mountains and vast solitudes that spread around him. Nor was the convent he was approaching a less sacred feature of the scene, as its grey walks and pinnacles appeared beyond the dusky groves. "Ah, if it should enclose her!" said Vivaldi, as he caught a first glimpse of its hall. Vain hope! I will not invite your illusions again. I will not expose myself to the agonies of new disappointment. I will search, but not expect. Yet, if she should be there... Having reached the gates of the convent, he passed with hasty steps into the court, where his emotion increased as he paused a moment and looked around its silent cloisters. The porter only appeared, when Vivaldi, fearful lest he should perceive him not to be a pilgrim, drew his hood over his face, and, gathering up his garments still closer in his folded arms, passed on without speaking, though he knew not which of the avenues before him led to the shrine. He advanced, however, towards the church, a stately edifice, detached, and at some little distance from the other parts of the convent. Its highly vaulted aisles, extending in twilight perspective, where a monk or a pilgrim only now and then crossed, whose dark figures, passing without sound, vanished like shadows. The universal stillness of the place, the gleam of the tapers from the high altar, and of lamps which gave a gloomy pomp to every shrine in the church, all these circumstances conspired to impress a sacred awe upon his heart. He followed some devotees through a side aisle to a court that was overhung by a tremendous rock, in which was a cave containing the shrine of Our Lady of Mount Carmel. This court was enclosed by the rock and by the choir of the church, except that to the south a small opening led the eye to a glimpse of the landscape below, which, seen beyond the dark jaws of the cliff, appeared free and light and gaily coloured, melting away into the blue and distant mountains. Vivaldi entered the cave, where, enclosed within a filigree screen of gold, lay the image of the saint, decorated with flowers and lighted up by innumerable lamps and tapers. The steps of the shrine were thronged with kneeling pilgrims, and Vivaldi, to avoid singularity, kneeled also, till a high peal of the organ at a distance, and the deep voices of choristers, announced that the first mass was begun. He left the cave, and returning into the church, loitered at an extremity of the aisles, where he listened a while to the solemn harmony pealing along the roofs and softening away in distance. It was such full and entrancing music as frequently swells in the high festivals of the Sicilian church, and is adapted to inspire that sublime enthusiasm which sometimes elevates its disciples. Vivaldi, unable to endure long the excess of feeling which this harmony awakened, was leaving the church when suddenly it ceased, and the tolling of a bell sounded in its stead. This seemed to be the knell of death, and it occurred to him that a dying person was approaching to receive the last sacrament, when he heard remotely a warbling of female voices, mingling with the deeper tones of the monks, and with the hollow note of the bell, as it struck at intervals. So sweetly, so plaintively did the strain grow on the air, that those who listened as well as those who sung were touched with sorrow, and seemed equally to mourn for a departing friend. Vivaldi hastened to the choir, the pavement of which was strewn with palm branches and fresh flowers. A pall of black velvet lay upon the steps of the altar, where several priests were silently attending. Everywhere appeared the ensigns of solemn pomp and ceremony, and in every countenance the stillness and observance of expectation. Meanwhile the sounds drew nearer, and Vivaldi perceived a procession of nuns approaching from a distant aisle. As they advanced, he distinguished the lady abbess, leading the train, dressed in her pontifical robes, with the mitre on her head, and well he marked her stately step, moving in time to the slow minstrelsy, and the air of proud yet graceful dignity with which she characterized herself. Then followed the nuns according to their several orders, and last came the novices, carrying lighted tapers, and surrounded by other nuns, who were distinguished by a particular habit. Having reached a part of the church appropriated for their reception, they arranged themselves in order. Vivaldi, with a palpitating heart, inquired the occasion of this ceremony, and was told that a nun was going to be professed. "You are informed, no doubt, brother," added the prior, who gave him this intelligence, "that on the morning of our high festival, Our Lady's Day, it is usual for such as devote themselves to heaven to receive the veil. Stand by a while, and you will see the ceremony." "What is the name of the novice who is now to receive it?" said Vivaldi, in a voice whose tremulous accents betrayed his emotion. The friar glanced an eye of scrutiny upon him as he replied, "I know not her name, but if you will step a little this way, I will point her out to you." Vivaldi, drawing his hood over his face, obeyed in silence. "It is she on the right of the abbess," said the stranger, "who leans on the arm of a nun. She is covered with a white veil, and is taller than her companions." Vivaldi observed her with a fearful eye, and though he did not recognise the person of Helena, yet whether it was that his fancy was possessed with her image, or that there was truth in his surmise, he thought he perceived a resemblance of her. He inquired how long the novice had resided in the convent, and many other particulars, to which the stranger either could not or dared not reply. With what anxious solicitude did Vivaldi endeavour to look through the veils of the several nuns in search of Elena, whom he believed the barbarous policy of his mother might already have devoted to the cloister. With a solicitude still stronger, he tried to catch a glimpse of the features of the novices, but their faces were shaded by hoods, and their white veils, though thrown half back, were disposed in such artful folds that they concealed them from observation as effectually as did the pendant lawn the features of the nuns. The ceremony began with the exhortation of the Father Abbot, delivered with solemn energy. Then the novice, kneeling before him, made her profession, for which Vivaldi listened with intense attention, but it was delivered in such low and trembling accents that he could not ascertain even the tone. But during the anthem that mingled with the ensuing part of the service, he thought he distinguished the voice of Elena, that touching and well-known voice, which in the church of San Lorenzo had first attracted his attention. He listened, scarcely daring to draw breath, lest he should lose a note, and again he fancied her voice spoke in a part of the plaintive response delivered by the nuns. Vivaldi endeavoured to command his emotion, and to await with patience some further unfolding of the truth. But when the priest prepared to withdraw the white veil from the face of the novice and throw the black one over her, a dreadful expectation that she was Elena seized him, and he with difficulty forbore stepping forward and discovering himself on the instant. The veil was at length withdrawn, and a very lovely face appeared, but not Elena's. Vivaldi breathed again, and waited with tolerable composure for the conclusion of the ceremony, till, in the solemn strain that followed the putting on of the black veil, he heard again the voice, which he was now convinced was hers. Its accents were low and mournful and tremulous, yet his heart acknowledged instantaneously their magic influence. When this ceremony was concluded, another began, and he was told it was that of a novitiation. A young woman, supported by two nuns, advanced to the altar, and Vivaldi thought he beheld Elena. The priest was beginning the customary exhortation, when she lifted her half veil, and, showing a countenance where meek sorrow was mingled with heavenly sweetness, raised her blue eyes, all bathed in tears, and waved a hand as if she would have spoken. It was Elena herself. The priest attempted to proceed. "I protest in the presence of this congregation," she said solemnly, "that I am brought hither to pronounce vows which my heart disclaims. I protest—" A confusion of voices interrupted her, and at the same instant she perceived Vivaldi rushing towards the altar. Elena gazed for a moment, and then, stretching forth her supplicating hands towards him, closed her eyes and sunk into the arms of some persons round her, who vainly endeavoured to prevent him from approaching and assisting her. The anguish with which he bent over her lifeless form and called upon her name excited the commiseration even of the nuns, and especially of Olivia, the most assiduous in efforts to revive her young friend. When Elena unclosed her eyes, and looking up, once more beheld Vivaldi, the expression with which she regarded him told that her heart was unchanged, and that she was unconscious of the miseries of imprisonment while he was with her. She desired to withdraw, and, assisted by Vivaldi and Olivia, was leaving the church when the abbess ordered that she should be attended by the nuns only, and, retiring from the altar, she gave directions that the young stranger should be conducted to the parlour of the convent. Vivaldi, though he refused to obey an imperious command, yielded to the entreaties of Elena and to the gentle remonstrances of Olivia, and, bidding Elena farewell for a while, he repaired to the parlour of the abbess. He was not without some hope of awakening her to a sense of justice or of pity, but he found that her notions of right were inexorably against him, and that pride and resentment usurped the influence of every other feeling. She began her lecture with expressing the warm friendship she had so long cherished for the Marchesa, proceeded to lament that the son of a friend whom she so highly esteemed should have forgotten his duty to his parents, and the observance due to the dignity of his house, so far as to seek connection with the person of Elena de Rosalba's inferior station, and concluded with a severe reprimand for having disturbed the tranquillity of the convent and the decorum of the church by his intrusion. Vivaldi listened with submitting patience to this mention of morals and decorum from a person who, with the most perfect self-applause, was violating some of the plainest obligations of humanity and justice, who had conspired to tear an orphan from her home, and who designed to deprive her for life of liberty, with all the blessings it inherits. But when she proceeded to speak of Elena with the auspice of severe reprobation, and to hint at the punishment which her public rejection of the vows had incurred, the patience of Vivaldi submitted no longer. Indignation and contempt rose high against the superior, and he exhibited a portrait of herself in the strong colours of truth. But the mind which compassion could not persuade, reason could not appall. Selfishness had hardened it alike to the influence of each. Her pride only was affected, and she retaliated the mortification she suffered by menace and denunciation. Vivaldi, on quitting her apartment, had no other resource than an application to the Abate, whose influence at least, if not his authority, might assuage the severity of her power. In this Abate, a mildness of temper and a gentleness of manner were qualities of less value than is usually and deservedly imputed to them; for being connected with feebleness of mind, they were but the pleasing merits of easy times, which, in an hour of difficulty, never assumed the character of virtues, by inducing him to serve those for whom he might feel. And thus, with a temper and disposition directly opposite to those of the severe and violent abbess, he was equally selfish and almost equally culpable, since, by permitting evil, he was nearly as injurious in his conduct as those who planned it. Indolence and timidity, a timidity the consequence of want of clear perception, deprived him of all energy of character. He was prudent rather than wise, and so fearful of being thought to do wrong that he seldom did right. To Vivaldi's temperate representations and earnest entreaties that he would exert some authority towards liberating Elena, he listened with patience, acknowledged the hardships of her situation, lamented the unhappy divisions between Vivaldi and his family, and then declined advancing a single step in so delicate an affair. Signora di Rosalba, he said, was in the care of the abbess, over whom he had no right of control in matters relative to her domestic concerns. Vivaldi then supplicated that, though he possessed no authority, he would at least intercede or remonstrate against so unjust a procedure as that of detaining Elena a prisoner, and assist in restoring her to her home, from which she had been forcibly carried. "And this again," replied the Abate, "does not come within my jurisdiction, and I make it a rule never to encroach upon that of another person." "And can you endure, Holy Father," said Vivaldi, "to witness a flagrant act of injustice, and not endeavour to counteract it? Not even step forward to rescue the victim, when you perceive the preparation for the sacrifice?" "I repeat that I never interfere with the authority of others," replied the superior. "Having asserted my own, I yield to them in their sphere the obedience which I require in mine." "Is power, then," said Vivaldi, "the infallible test of justice? Is it morality to obey where the command is criminal? The whole world have a claim upon the fortitude, the active fortitude of those who are placed as you are, between the alternative of confirming a wrong by your consent, or preventing it by your resistance. Would that your heart expanded towards that world, reverend father. Would that the whole world were wrong, that you might have the glory of setting it right," said the Abate, smiling. "Young man, you are an enthusiast, and I pardon you. You are a knight of chivalry, who would go about the earth fighting with everybody by way of proving your right to do good. It is unfortunate that you have born somewhat too late." "Enthusiasm in the cause of humanity," said Vivaldi, But he checked himself, and despairing of touching a heart so hardened by selfish prudence, and indignant at beholding an apathy so vicious in its consequence, he left the Abate without other effort. He perceived that he must now have recourse to further stratagem, a recourse which his frank and noble mind detested. But he had already tried without success every other possibility of rescuing the innocent victim of the Marchese's prejudice and pride. Helena, meanwhile, had retired to her cell, agitated by a variety of considerations and contrary emotions, of which, however, those of joy and tenderness were long predominant. Then came anxiety, apprehension, pride, and doubt, to divide and torture her heart. It was true that Vivaldi had discovered her prison; but, if it were possible that he could release her, she must consent to quit it with him, a step from which a mind so tremblingly jealous of propriety as hers recoiled with alarm, though it would deliver her from captivity. And how, when she considered the haughty character of the Marchese di Vivaldi, the imperious and vindictive nature of the Marchesa, and still more their united repugnance of a connection with her, how could she endure to think, even for a moment, of intruding herself into such a family? Pride, delicacy, good sense, seemed to warn her against a conduct so humiliating and vexatious in its consequences, and to exhort her to preserve her own dignity by independence. But the esteem, the friendship, the tender affection which she had cherished for Vivaldi made her pause and shrink with emotions of little less than horror from the eternal renunciation which so dignified a choice required. Though the encouragement which her deceased relative had given to this attachment seemed to impart to it a sacred character, that considerably soothed the alarmed delicacy of Helena. The approbation thus implied had no power to silence her own objections, and she would have regretted the mistaken zeal which had contributed to lead her into the present distressing situation, had she revered the memory of her aunt or loved Vivaldi less. Still, however, the joy which his presence had occasioned, and which the consciousness that he was still near her had prolonged, was not subdued, though it was frequently obscured, by such anxious considerations. With jealous and indiscreet solicitude, she now recollected every look, and the accent of every word, which had told that his affection was undiminished, thus seeking with inconsistent zeal for a conviction of the very tenderness which but a moment before she had thought it prudent to lament, and almost necessary to renounce. She awaited with extreme anxiety the appearance of Olivia, who might probably know the result of Vivaldi's conference with the abbess, and whether he was yet in the convent. In the evening Olivia came, a messenger of evil, and Helena, informed of the conduct of the abbess and the consequent departure of Vivaldi, perceived all her courage, all the half-formed resolutions which a consideration of his family had suggested, falter and expire. Sensible only of grief and despondency, she ascertained for the first time the extent of her affection and the severity of her situation. She perceived also that the injustice which his family had exercised towards her absolved her from all consideration of their displeasure, otherwise than as it might affect herself. But this was a conviction which it were now probably useless to admit. Olivia not only expressed the tenderest interest in her welfare, but seemed deeply affected with her situation; and whether it was that the nun's misfortune bore some resemblance to Helena's, or from whatever cause, it is remarkable that her eyes were often filled with tears while she regarded her young friend, and she betrayed so much emotion that Helena noticed it with surprise. She was, however, too delicate to hint any curiosity on the subject, and too much engaged by a nearer interest to dwell long upon the circumstance. When Olivia withdrew, Helena retired to her turret, to soothe her spirits with a view of serene and majestic nature, a recourse which seldom failed to elevate her mind, and soften the asperities of affliction. It was to her like sweet and solemn music, breathing peace over the soul, like the oaten stop of Milton's spirit, who with his soft pipe and smooth ditted song well knew to still the wild winds when they roar, and hush the waving woods. While she sat before a window, observing the evening light beaming up the valley, and touching all the distant mountains with misty purple, a reed as sweet, though not as fanciful, sounded from among the rocks below. The instrument and the character of the strain were such as she had been accustomed to hear within the walls of San Stefano, and the tone diffused over her spirits a pleasing melancholy that rapt all her attention. The liquid cadence, as it trembled and sunk away, seemed to tell the dejection of no vulgar feelings, and the exquisite taste with which the complaining notes were again swelled almost convinced her that the musician was Vivaldi. On looking from the lattice, she perceived a person perched on a point of the cliff below, whither it appeared almost impracticable for any human step to have climbed, and preserved from the precipice only by some dwarf shrubs that fringed the brow. The twilight did not permit her immediately to ascertain whether it was Vivaldi, and the situation was so dangerous that she hoped it was not he. Her doubts were removed when, looking up, he perceived Elena, and she heard his voice. Vivaldi had learned from a lay brother of the convent, whom Paolo had bribed, and who, when he worked in the garden, had sometimes seen Elena at the window, that she frequented this remote turret, and at the hazard of his life he had now ventured thither with the hope of conversing with her. Elena, alarmed at his tremendous situation, refused to listen to him, but he would not leave the spot till he had communicated a plan concerted for her escape, and, entreating that she would confide herself to his care, assured her that she would be conducted wherever she judged proper. It appeared that the brother had consented to assist his views, in consideration of an ample reward, and to admit him within the walls on this evening, when, in his pilgrim's habit, he might have an opportunity of again seeing Elena. He conjured her to attend, if possible, in the convent parlour during supper, explaining in a few words the motive for this request and the substance of the following particulars. The lady abbess, in observance of the custom upon high festivals, gave a collation to the padre abate, and such of the priests as had assisted at the vesper service. A few strangers of distinction and pilgrims were also to partake of the entertainments of this night, among which was included a concert to be performed by the nuns. At the collation which was to be displayed, a profusion of delicacies, arranged by the sisters, who had been busy in preparing the pastry and confectionery during several days, and who excelled in these articles no less than in embroidery and other ingenious arts. This supper was to be given in the abbess's outer parlour, while she herself, attended by some nuns of high rank and a few favourites, was to have a table in the inner apartment, where, separated only by the grate, she could partake of the conversation of the Holy Fathers. The tables were to be ornamented with artificial flowers, and a variety of other fanciful devices, upon which the ingenuity of the sisters had been long employed, who prepared for these festivals with as much vanity, and expected them to dissipate the gloomy monotony of their usual life, with as much eagerness of delight as a young beauty anticipates a first ball. On this evening, therefore, every member of the convent would be engaged either by amusement or business; and to Vivaldi, who had been careful to inform himself of these circumstances, it would be easy, with the assistance of the brother, to obtain admittance and mingle himself among the spectators, disguised in his pilgrim's habit. He entreated, therefore, that Elena would contrive to be in the abbess's apartment this evening, when he would endeavour to convey to her some further particulars of the plan of escape, and would have mules in waiting at the foot of the mountain to conduct her to the Villa Altieri, or to the neighbouring convent of the Santa della Pieta. Vivaldi secretly hoped that she might be prevailed with to give him her hand on quitting San Stefano, but he forbore to mention this hope. lest it should be mistaken for a condition, and that Helena might be either reluctant to accept his assistance, or, accepting it, might consider herself bound to grant a hasty consent. To his mention of escape she listened with varying emotion, at one moment attending to it with hope and joy, as promising her only chance of liberation from an imprisonment which was probably intended to last for her life, and of restoring her to Vivaldi; and at another, recoiling from the thought of departing with him while his family was so decidedly averse to their marriage. Thus unable to form any instant resolution on the subject, and entreating that he would leave his dangerous station before the thickening twilight should increase the hazard of his descent, Helena added that she would endeavour to obtain admittance to the apartment of the abbess, and to acquaint him with her final determination. Vivaldi understood all the delicacy of her scruples, and though they afflicted him, he honoured the good sense and just pride that suggested them. He lingered on the rock till the last moments of departing light, and then, with a heart fluttering with hopes and fears, bade Helena farewell, and descended. While she watched his progress through the silent gloom, faintly distinguished him gliding along ledges of the precipice, and making his adventurous way from cliff to cliff, till the winding thickets concealed him from her view. Still anxious, she remained at the lattice, but he appeared no more. No voice announced disaster, and at length she returned to her cell to deliberate on the subject of her departure. Her considerations were interrupted by Olivia, whose manner indicated something extraordinary. The usual tranquillity of her countenance was gone, and an air of grief mingled with apprehension appeared there. Before she spoke, she examined the passage and looked around the cell. "It is as I feared," she said abruptly. "My suspicions are justified, and you, my child, are sacrificed, unless it were possible for you to quit the convent this night." "What is it that you mean?" said the alarmed Helena. "I have just learned," resumed the nun, "that your conduct this morning, which is understood to have thrown a premeditated insult upon the abbess, is to be punished with what they call imprisonment. Alas! why should I soften the truth with what I believe is death itself for whoever returned alive from that hideous chamber?" "With death!" said Helena, aghast. "Oh, heavens! how have I deserved death?" "That is not the question, my daughter, but how you may avoid it. Within the deepest recesses of our convent is a stone chamber, secured by doors of iron, to which such of the sisterhood as have been guilty of any heinous offence have, from time to time, been consigned. This condemnation admits of no reprieve. The unfortunate captive is left to languish in chains and darkness, receiving only an allowance of bread and water just sufficient to prolong her sufferings, till nature at length, sinking under their intolerable pressure, obtains refuge in death. Our records relate several instances of such horrible punishment, which has generally been inflicted upon nuns who, weary of the life which they have chosen under the first illusions of the imagination, or which they have been compelled to accept by the rigour or avarice of parents, have been detected in escaping from the convent." The nun paused, but Helena remained wrapped in silent thought. She resumed: "One miserable instance of this severity has occurred within my memory. I saw the wretched victim enter that apartment, never more to quit it alive. I saw also her poor remains laid at rest in the convent garden. During nearly 2 years she languished upon a bed of straw, denied even the poor consolation of conversing through the grate with such of the sisters as pitied her. And who of us was there that did not pity her? A severe punishment was threatened to those who should approach with any compassionate intention. Thank God I incurred it, and I endured it also with secret triumph." A gleam of satisfaction passed over Olivia's countenance as she spoke this. It was the sweetest that Helena had ever observed there. With a sympathetic emotion, she threw herself on the bosom of the nun and wept. For some moments they were both silent. Olivia at length said: Do you not believe, my child, that the officious and offended abbess will readily seize upon the circumstances of your disobedience as a pretence for confining you in that fatal chamber? The wishes of the Marchesa will thus surely be accomplished, without the difficulty of exacting your obedience to the vows. Alas, I have received proof too absolute of her intention, and that tomorrow is assigned as the day of your sacrifice. You may perhaps be thankful that the business of the festival has obliged her to defer executing the sentence even until tomorrow." Elena replied only with a groan, as her head still drooped upon the shoulder of the nun. She was not now hesitating whether to accept the assistance of Vivaldi, but desponding lest his utmost efforts for her deliverance should be in vain. Olivia, who mistook the cause of her silence, added, "Other hints I could give, which are strong as they are dreadful, but I will forbear. Tell me how it is possible I may assist you. I am willing to incur a second punishment in endeavouring to relieve a second sufferer." Elena's tears flowed fast at this new instance of the nun's generosity. "But if they should discover you in assisting me to leave the convent," she said, in a voice convulsed by her gratitude, "oh, if they should discover you—" "I can ascertain the punishment," Olivia replied with firmness, "and do not fear to meet it." "How nobly generous this is!" said the weeping Elena. "I ought not to suffer you to be thus careless of yourself." "My conduct is not wholly disinterested," the nun modestly replied; "for I think I could endure any punishment with more fortitude than the sickening anguish of beholding such suffering as I have witnessed. What are bodily pains in comparison with the subtle, the exquisite tortures of the mind? Heaven knows I can support my own afflictions, but not the view of those of others when they are excessive. The instruments of torture I believe I could endure, if my spirit was invigorated with the consciousness of a generous purpose. But pity touches upon a nerve that vibrates instantly to the heart, and subdues resistance. Yes, my child, the agony of pity is keener than any other, except that of remorse; and even in remorse it is, perhaps, the mingling, unavailing pity that points the sting. But while I am indulging this egotism, I am, perhaps, increasing your danger of the suffering I deprecate." Elena, thus encouraged by the generous sympathy of Olivia, mentioned Vivaldi's purposed visit of this evening, and consulted with her on the probability of procuring admittance for herself to the abbess's parlour. Reanimated by this intelligence, Olivia advised her to repair not only to the supper room, but to attend the previous concert, to which several strangers would be admitted, among whom might probably be Vivaldi. When to this Elena objected her dread of the abbess's observation, and of the immediate seclusion that would follow, Olivia soothed her fears of discovery by offering her the disguise of a nun's veil, and promising not only to conduct her to the apartment, but to afford her every possible assistance towards her escape. "Among the crowd of nuns who will attend you in that spacious apartment," Olivia added, "it is improbable you would be distinguished, even if the sisters were less occupied by amusement, and the abbess were at leisure to scrutinise. As it is, you will hazard little danger of discovery. The superior, if she thinks of you at all, will believe that you are still a prisoner in your cell; but this is an evening of too much importance to her vanity for any consideration distinct from that emotion to divide her attention. Let hope, therefore, support you, my child, and do you prepare a few lines to acquaint Vivaldi with your consent to his proposal, and with the urgency of your circumstances. You may perhaps find an opportunity of conveying them through the grate." They were still conversing on this subject when a particular chime sounded, which Olivia said summoned the nuns to the concert room, and she immediately hastened for a black veil, while Elena wrote the few lines that were necessary for Vivaldi. End of chapter 11.
Thanks so much for joining me for another chapter and more WIP progress. If you're enjoying the slow sparkle journey, hit that like button and consider subscribing so you don't miss the next part. I'll see you in part 8 with more drills, more gothic drama, and hopefully no spills this time. Bye bye.